Hello, science people. It's time for an episode of Storytime with Mr. Bird. Today's story time is about the spontaneous generation of maggots, or the experiment that proved maggots do not spontaneously generate. A long time ago, people used to believe in spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation is the belief that life can come from nothing. And sometimes life does appear to come from nothing. If I leave out a piece of bread, all of a sudden mold is growing on it. Well, I didn't have mold anywhere else. Where did the mold come from? It appeared to spontaneously generate. The same thing was thought with maggots, which are the larvae or babies of flies. People would leave meat out, and then after a few days, maggots would appear on the meat. It seemed as though the maggots spontaneously generated. Well, today we know that spontaneous generation is not true. We know that life cannot come from nothing. We know this because of cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells. But in the late 1600s, there was a physician, Francesco Redi, who created an experiment to test this. What he did was he took two jars. He placed a piece of meat in both jars. One of the jars he covered with gauze. The other jar he left open. His hypothesis was that flies lay eggs on meat, which then hatch and then become the maggots. And so his experiment was that the flies would not be able to land on the meat because of the gauze blocking the jar. So he left these two jars out, and sure enough, the jar that was open grew maggots within a few days. The jar that was covered by gauze did not grow maggots. And so his hypothesis gained support that maggots came from flies. And if you block flies from landing on meat, you will block the growth of maggots. Okay, so what about mold? Mold to most of us still seems like it comes from nowhere. Well, actually, the way that mold reproduces is it throws spores, microscopic spores, which are clones of itself, into the air. These mold spores float around in the air. We're breathing them in all the time. They're all in our houses, they're everywhere. And so when you leave out a piece of bread, what happens is the mold spores land on the bread and then they start growing into the mold. Because the spores are microscopic, you don't see them on the bread until they grow big enough to become a large colony visible by the human eye. So mold does not spontaneously generate. No living thing does. And so whenever you see life showing up, it had to come from somewhere. One of the reasons that we use refrigeration is because there is mold spores on all of our food. And so if you put food in the refrigerator, the temperature is such that the mold cannot grow, or it grows so slowly that you won't see the colony of mold by the time you eat your food. And so the refrigeration is preventing the mold growth that is already on all of our food. It's already all in our air. So again, living things cannot spontaneously generate. It's already there, all around us.